keeping me very busy, but crazy week. Absolutely crazy.
So what's kind of the take in the political community, writer community, economist community? I don't know what term should I use? What's the best term?
Speechless is really, I think people are just astounded. I mean, this discovery that they essentially, somebody in the White House, it looks like it was done literally at the last. It looks like it was a White House intern, frankly, who, leaves their essays to the last minute, then goes to ChatGPT. It's clear that it was produced by a chatbot, this list of tariffs. And all their attempt
There is speculation about that.
Well, it's more than speculation. It's pretty clear now. It's almost certain. The other thing, bizarrely, somebody worked out today, they didn't do it because one of the weird things was, they had these these territories showing up in the list, like in the McDonald and Heard Islands, which have no people. It's just penguins. And they're trying to figure out how on earth did they do this? Well, they said they did it country by country, but it's pretty clear, actually. Somebody reverse engineered it, worked out what they were doing is they didn't do it country by country. Again, it was all done by a chatbot. Was going by domain names, assuming every domain name that they were using was a country. But there are islands which have their own domain names. So, for example, Reunion Island got its own set of tariffs, even though it's actually a part of France. It just happens to have a separate domain name. And McDonald and Heard Islands has its own domain name. So it's just wild. So this is the way policy is being designed. It's pretty bizarre. I think basically Trump's approach is you basically he thinks of this as, it's kind of like he's buying a used car. So you sort of set your price, you set it way above, or if you're the salesman, or way above what you're willing to take, or way below if you're the purchaser, and then you negotiate. And so I think they just sort of came up with these arbitrary figures that would really be punishing to all these countries, and then say, okay, negotiate. Not entirely clear what they're negotiating for, just somehow to get them to buy more U.S. imports. And but of course, it's what it's done is just sowed panic that the United States is. It's not just that it's run by a high school dance committee. It's that it's the very fact that its electoral and political system can produce a government of such low caliber. I mean, bear in mind, these are people carrying out major security operations on signal chats and inadvertently inverting journalists. I mean, it's just the level of amateurism is mind-boggling.
It's the amateur hour.
It very much is amateur hour. So I think one of the things I have found interesting is since the start of the Trump administration has been the very sharp fall in the world price of the dollar, the US dollar, of course. And I think that really suggests that the world is kind of losing faith in America, and that's going to be a huge problem because so much. I mean, nearly a fifth of the stock market is owned by Europeans alone. And if foreign fund managers, and it looks like they are pulling out, the only reason, from what I can tell, the stock market hasn't just crashed completely in America, because institutional investors and foreigners have been pulling out. But retail investors have been propping it up. Now, my belief is that's the MAGA crowd who really are buying. Until now, the line they keep hearing for the Trump administration, this is all part of a plan, where the whole idea is to sort of squeeze the excess out of the economy and then make it bounce back on rocket fuel. So they're buying the dip.
Exactly. I was going to ask that.
And
is the idea to crash the economy, buy everything for cheap, and then watch things rise again?
Look, there's a theory that you can do that, but I don't think they're doing it. They're just crashing the economy. There's no strategy. And I think it's just rationalization. And if you listen to the people in the Trump administration going before the cameras and saying this, I mean, Elon Musk has an idea, a very rough idea drawn from Austrian economics about how you crash the economy and therefore unleash the productive forces, although it's actually a bit incoherent, to be honest. But that's not what they're doing. They're just sabotaging. They're just bomb throwers. And it was actually a journalist named James Suretsky who worked it out. The first thing he worked out is he figured out what they're doing. He said they're basically taking every country's trade surplus or deficit with the U.S., dividing it by the total volume of imports the U.S. gets from that country, and then dividing the result by 2. And then that they round it, and they worked it out. And then there was a finance house, and then the Financial Times also, ran the exercise themselves, and they found, lo and behold, this is it. This is now why. How on earth, though, did they come up with this formula? What was the rationale? There's no logic to it. And somebody had the clever idea of asking. He started with not with ChatGPT. They later tried ChatGPT, but tried one of the other LLMs, and basically dictated and what would be a simple way to sort of work out what tariff should be on every country in order to put the U.S. on a level playing field. Lo and behold, out comes this formula. They tried it on several chatbots. They got the same answer. In other words, this is just, feeding off this.
This is pretty
literally
cut and dry.
Then the White House, obviously they were feeling under pressure at this point. They put out this the mathematical formula. This is absolute nonsense. We did use really sophisticated reasoning, and they produced this math formula with all the Greek symbols in it, that you get in any kind of an econometric formulation. It looked, okay, so maybe this is serious, until very quickly, of course, didn't take long. You had to have anybody who'd done first year econometrics or second year econometrics would have been able to figure it out, and they did. They said, and in fact, if you go on the internet, there is a hilarious tweet, the 4 steps, where you basically get from the Greek math right back to the formula of trade deficit divided by imports cut into. There's a chap, look it up right now, Google it. It's by a chap named Stinson Dean. And he shows it, and he shows basically each 4 steps, somebody, starts with a human face, but they're putting makeup on, and by the end, it's a clown face. It's absolutely hilarious, but it basically summarizes. And then this morning, somebody else reverse engineered or back engineered to work out that the reason they come up with these weird sort of islands in the list was because they weren't doing it by country as they insisted. They were doing it by domain name, and that was just because the computer was doing it. So,
Dr. Rapley, I'm going to share
I'm going
to share my screen here because I think we can do that with Riverside. Can you see?
Okay.
This is the tweet.
That's it. It's a beauty.
So you see. What is going up in the top part?
Well, look at it. I mean, look at the way he does it. He says, okay, so if we take X to be exports, M to be imports, and then you see they have the 2 Greek numerals, but then you insert your numbers. And so they say, well, you make it 4 by a quarter times imports, you get right back to the formula. In other words, this was an attempt to obfuscate, and it failed miserably because whoever was doing the econometrics, obviously they had done, they probably haven't even, it's probably a White House intern who hasn't yet finished the 2nd year course in econometrics and didn't realize that an econometrician would quickly deconstruct this and see how ridiculous it was. So this is where we are. The world's the most powerful and richest state in human history is run by somebody who probably doesn't get any of this, I suspect. And that's a bit alarming to investors from around the world. And it's also alarming to governments who are sort of immediately saying, is this really happening? I mean, we're in a military alliance with somebody who thinks this way? And anyway, it is an interesting time. You can't make this stuff up.
You're in South Africa right now. What do people think about Elon Musk in South Africa?
Well, they hope America keeps him. There is this sort of please don't send him back. There's a no returns policy. Elon Musk is, at one time he would have been seen as kind of like, this is what, the kind of genius talent we can produce that goes to waste in South Africa, so it goes off elsewhere. But I think there was always a very kind of conflicted relationship. He has this, and of course, people have been digging into his family history ever since he's gone kind of down this weird right-wing rabbit hole. And, his grandfather was a member, because of course they originally came from Canada, the family. The reason they ended up in South Africa is because the grandparents migrated to South Africa, and they migrated to South Africa because the father was a member of the Canadian Nazi Party. So the grandfather was a member. So this is his mother's father. Moved to South Africa under apartheid because this was the country that knew how to do things right, knew how, the white supremacy and keep blacks in place.
Is that's actually why?
Yeah, that's well known. I mean, and they don't hide this. I mean, his mother has not really abandoned these views. So Elon Musk grew up with this, and he grew up, of course. He would have spent a good chunk of his formative years and into adulthood, living under apartheid, and therefore benefiting, such as it was, from apartheid. I believe he went to his grandfather. I think there's German ancestry. So they got South African, obviously, because they were attracted to apartheid. They were kind of drawn to the Afrikaans cultural side. Put him in, I believe he spent some time in an Afrikaans school where the discipline is extremely strict, and particularly at that time. And bullying is quite common. I think he was bullied. He was a kind of nerdish kid. And so, I think that also probably created some kind of complexes. But the main thing is, there is a very interesting argument. I think it's by, there's a BBC podcast series. I think her name is Jill Lepore. And she did, I think it's called Rocket Man. And I would recommend you listen to it, who makes this. And she's not the only one. There are many others who've done it. But essentially says that if you really look at, there's a group of them very close to Trump, the so-called tech bros. So this would include Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Elon Musk, and there's one others, but all of them.
Mark Andreessen, is that the other guy?
No, I don't think so. He might be one of them, but these ones specifically, there's the South African connection. And if you really sort of deconstruct their peculiar political philosophy, which is essentially like Thiel's anti-democratic philosophy, it really is an attempt to recreate apartheid. Even, Lepore's argument is Musk's vision of colonizing Mars is really about creating, once again, a sort of walled enclave where you can keep the townships out. So that's, it's an interesting sort of
that's
attempt
crazy.
at sort of trying to use psychology to understand their thinking. But of course, he's got his own problems now, because his businesses are all, with the exception of SpaceX, are all in real trouble. And they're going to be in even worse trouble when Trump is no longer in office, because to a very substantial degree, he's benefiting from his ties to Trump. But of course, he's now starting to suffer from those. So, it's just a matter of time before his own shareholders call time on him.
Well, that's kind of what I'm wondering is, like, what's the end game? I mean, Trump is older, so I guess he suspects he's kind of nearing the end of his life. Maybe he's just going balls to the wall for the last few years. I think he's like in his early 80s. But then, like, someone like Elon,
his late 70s, yeah.
Elon, he's going to be around for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a very good question. I think there's various, I don't know Elon Musk, so I can't say. I mean, there's various speculations. There are those, some who believes he really does he's not really fundamentally that driven by the success of his business ventures, that he really is driven by this kind of peculiar political philosophy of his, and he wants to create this kind of vision of utopia, and he sees the Trump as being, for want of a better word, a sort of useful idiot, somebody he can use as part of that plan to bring this about. That he's really serious about space colonization. He's really serious about, and Peter Thiel as well is really serious about changing the American Republic to make it to put it in their image. What's the name of this guy? You'll know the name, Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin. You're familiar with that name?
No,
So
I'm
Curtis
not.
Yarvin is basically the court philosopher of this group. You'd find Curtis Yarvin interesting. I'd recommend you read him. And he basically articulates, and he sees the ideal society, a utopia, being essentially run by tech bros, undemocratic, whereby this is always a challenge: is how do you ensure that, in fact, people who rise to the top are in fact the brightest? But the idea that you have essentially a Nietzschean view of the world, which is that some are born to rule and others shouldn't have power over them. And that everybody will be better off if we go back to this kind of modern, kind of what a Danish philosopher in talking about Nietzsche called aristocratic radicalism. Essentially that you recreate an aristocracy, but unlike the historical traditional view of aristocracy in European tradition, at any rate, where there was a sense of noblesse oblige, that you have a duty to look after ordinary people, that the aristocratic radicalism is they're completely unbound and they should do what they want. It kind of like, I would say, one of the earliest philosophical expressions of this you get well before Nietzsche even is in the Marquis de Sade. If you read some of his work, I mean, that was essentially the view they took. There's a very good Italian film. I mean, I'm really digressing here, but I find this also interesting. By a director called Pasolini. It was made in the 60s, I think, and it was called Salo, after the Republic of Salo, the short-lived, the 4-month republic created by Mussolini at the end of the war, basically a Nazi puppet state. And just as it happened, because it lasted 120 days, and the Marquis de Sade's book, the 120 Days of Sodom, it was just a perfect overlap. So he used the Republic of Salo as being a metaphor for this kind of aristocratic view of the world. And it's a kind of disturbing film, but if you ever, that's one I would recommend somebody watch to really understand the core view of this worldview, that really the world, there's a class of men, and it's mostly men, born to rule, and they should be completely unleashed to do what they want to anyone they want. And that is, I think, it's not that Trump shares that view necessarily, but they see Trump as a vehicle by which I think they can bring this about. So that's one theory about what's really driving Musk. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. It doesn't seem like he's using it the way some of the other tech bros. I think they made a mistaken assumption, people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, that by cozying up to him, they would benefit their businesses. But in fact, their share prices have done terribly since the start of the year. So I think that was a miscalculation. I don't think Musk is in it for the money in that sense. I think his companies are collapsing, but I don't think he's terribly bothered. He might be if some of the shareholders were to try and force a hostile takeover of Tesla, for example, and push him out altogether. He might be roped back in. And it'll be interesting to see, because there are some very big institutional shareholders of Tesla who can't be very happy, who are going to be coming under pressure from their own clients. A company like BlackRock, which manages a lot of money for big pension funds, for example, they've lost a ton of money in the collapse of Tesla. And I think they've been willing to be nice, partly because they want to maintain themselves good relations with Trump. But I can't see that enduring, because they're going to be coming under a lot of pressure from their clients, whose own clients, as it were. And that, you think of the chain, you think of pension fund manager, and their clients are their pension fund recipients. And they're starting to say, we may have to, cut back your pension next year because we made some bad calls. That pressure is going to work its way back through the chain if markets continue the way they're going.
Right. I mean, at an ideological level, again, we can argue the implementation side of it, but do you feel that behind the scenes, there's a vision behind cutting government spending, making things more efficient, or is this just a veil to do what you said they might be doing?
I think the difficulty is that there's a bunch of different people have different agendas. and I think the difficulty is it's like it is a case of there's a lot of cooks, and so there's no coherence. As I say, you can make a case. I mean, an example of successful austerity crashing the economy and then bringing about an economic boom. Now, you can debate whether structurally these were good developments for the economy, but in the early 1980s, that's what both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher did, and that was essentially their strategy, and they stuck by it. And within the terms of how they measured success, their policy succeeded, and so for decades after, their descendants sort of looked to them as iconic, as being models of how to do things. But there's no such coherent strategy in what is being done by the Trump administration. It's, at least if there is, I can't see what it is. I can't discern anything. And I think part of the problem is that, well, it's not part of the problem, it is the problem. I think Trump himself has no particular strategy. I think the man is, you talk about his age, his advanced age. Some people, as they get older, become philosophical. They start to spend more time with their grandchildren. They become softer, and more forgiving. And then some people become bitter and angry. And he comes back, he's clearly filled with grievance. To a very considerable degree, he's using the powers of his office to settle scores from, throughout his life, and certainly his political career. I think he really does think America's been ripped off, and he's going to put other countries in their place. And it's hurting an awful lot of people who voted for him, but I'm not sure he's bothered, because despite what he says, he's not going to get a third term of office, and I think he knows it. So I think he's just not really, in his first term, he seemed very attuned to the sentiment of his followers, and this time he just doesn't seem to care. At least he's not showing signs of it. He seems detached. And of course, the other problem is, I think this is kind of, it's hard to avoid late imperial analogies, but this is kind of like, this is like Stalin's Politburo near the end of his life. Because in the first term, he brought in people who had by and large, had a certain amount of reputation, had their own views of the world. Some of them very intelligent, not necessarily people whose views I would share, but certainly someone like William Barr as the Attorney General. I don't share his view of the world at all, but extraordinarily intelligent man with a very consistent set of beliefs. But the problem is he was able to think for himself, and Trump doesn't want them thinking for themselves. So he has surrounded himself with a remarkable coterie of yes men and yes women, some of whom have very little intellectual heft and little, if any reputation. I mean, in his economic team, the only person who has any real reputation of his own coming in is the Treasury Secretary, but he's been reduced himself to, it sounds like he wasn't even in on the discussion of these tariffs. I mean, to listen to his interviews.
Is it just like a fear thing? Like, if I don't comply, then I'm out of the club?
I think some of them are
These people are smart, but they got to toe the party line. They got a nice job, they got the vacation house. They don't want to lose that stuff.
Well, you say that, Cass. I'm not sure some of them are that smart. I think in Scott Besson's case, I don't know. I'd love to know what the man is thinking, because I think he sees his reputation going up in flames. He can't believe that this is the right thing to do. But yes, you can't speak against your president. But in the case of someone like Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, I think he probably thinks, and a lot of them are, it's become rather cultish. They just sort of, now their line is, well, I can't see what the logic is, but Trump is such a genius, none of us will. We just have to trust him. We're getting that one a lot now. Trust him. Let him sort it out. He will do it. And wow. To think that we are here. That, I think, but anyway, the long and short of it is that whereas in his first administration, something as harebrained of this would have been shot down before it saw the light of day by his own team. This time they're all just saying, yes, you're a genius, go for it, boss. And it's an echo chamber. And I think, therefore, the potential damage to the economy is going to be quite considerable. If the market is down, I mean, what is it now? I haven't checked lately. It was this morning, it was down over 10% since the start of the year.
Yeah, it's not great.
And they're not.
It's not great.
It's not, at the moment, it's not a vote of confidence. And again, you could make a case. I mean, I often use, for example, to contrast a case of someone who was crashing the economy, but all along you could sort of see the reasoning behind it. And if you look at Ronald Reagan's 1982 State of the Union address to Congress, which I think is one of the masterpieces of modern speech, here was a situation where the economy was crashing and all the normal indicators were, sort of really ringing alarm bells. And he gives a speech to Congress where he acknowledges this, but he explains in this way. And of course, he had this remarkable ability to convey optimism, that this is all working out. And it's not just, it wasn't to trust me. He would explain how it was in that speech, what this is going to do and how it's going to benefit. And lo and behold, in the summer of 1982, in August of 1982, the stock market bottomed after a nearly decade-long bear market, and then began a bull market that lasted until the turn of the millennium. And the economy by 1983 was turning around. So you see, there was this vision. He communicates it. He's saying, "Stick with me. I know what I'm doing." They're not saying that with Trump. They're just saying, well, I don't know what he's doing, but trust him. He's a genius. And there's no evidence of genius. Trump is not indicating. He's not saying how this fits into a plan. He just keeps repeating it's going to make America great again. And, and I think by the time the amount of damage that will be done before they finally, I think, realize this isn't actually a genius plan, I think it could be quite severe. I could see the stock market going down by a lot more than it's gone down. I mean, a lot more. I could see the economy in recession, and I could see the Republicans facing an absolute rout in the midterm elections, and then maybe they'll say, actually, maybe this isn't working.
I read that China, South Korea, and Japan are teaming up now as a means of a retaliatory tariff. Is that true? And I guess the question I have on top of that is, what do you think China's role is going to be moving forward in terms of soft power, given like what's been done with US aid and things like that? Is there kind of a door open Trump now for China to sneak in?
I mean, I don't know if you read Noah Smith, who is an economics blogger, and he would be one of the economics bloggers I recommend you follow. Again, I don't always, in fact, he and I disagree about a lot of things, but he's very good. And he says, he's been saying, when people would say, well, Trump is a Putin plant, and he kept saying no, but he said, but if you wanted a Putin plant, it would be hard to sort of find a better one than Trump. But actually, I think you could say he's more like a China plant. He's doing tremendous good for China. He is making China great again. First of all, it's making soft power very easy. The Chinese don't have, historically, I would say, the diplomatic sophistication of Western diplomatic corps, and they tend to, in the past, they use this. They were doing this wolf warrior thing, which was not helping their reputation. It tended to be bristle a bit too, and didn't necessarily treat criticisms of their society with subtlety. But then along comes Trump and his view of diplomacy, which is essentially to sit presidents down in the Oval Office and humiliate them in front of live television. There is a pivot. Lots of countries are pivoting to China. They're saying, well, China is, first of all, even if you don't like its politics, it's at least predictable. There is regime stability. The direction of Chinese policy will change substantially from one leader to the next, but the overall orientation of economic policy doesn't. China, for example, and in its foreign policy has been remarkably consistent throughout. Throughout much of its history, even before the communist period. So there is this stability that no longer exists in American foreign policy. And so, and moreover, with markets now being closed in America, you get, I was just reading this morning, for example, Samsung is looking to sell more to China because it's losing access to the American market. And so that's going to deepen ties between South Korea and China. And these are not countries, South Korea and China have historically had good relations, but China and Japan haven't. But I think they just see themselves as being forced together. And more countries, what is interesting is you may have noticed that, in fact, China has now responded. They're going to impose the same tariff on the U.S., 34% on any imports from the U.S. But of course, what they're not doing is they're not imposing across-the-board tariffs on the rest of the world. Instead, I expect the Chinese government is going to, ramp up its domestic fiscal stimulus, try and raise consumption, which is going to make it a more attractive trading partner for other countries. And so countries that are finding the United States hostile and unpredictable, including Western countries, I think are going to start deepening their relations with China. So I see China being the victor ultimately from all this. And I think, I've said all along that I think greatest, people say what country is going to get hurt the worst by Trump? Is it going to be developing countries? Is it going to be China? I've said all along, the biggest victim of Trump is going to be America. And I stand by that.
Yeah. Do you think this is a historic time? Like we're living through history? Because a lot of people are saying that online, but I mean, you're a historian, you're an economist. Is this another history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme kind of moment?
I wouldn't. I do think it's historic. Look, every moment is historic by definition.
Sure.
But I think it's a turning point. I think it's a major turning point in that it is the end of the U.S.-led Western Empire. That was my last book, and in the book my co-author and I, we were very clear. We said that any attempt to revive a kind of MAGA-like recreation of greatness is going to accelerate the decline, in this case, of the U.S. And I think that's true. I think we can say that definitively the U.S.-led international order is over. Therefore, the American century is finished, if you want to call it that. Whether or not that means it's the end of the Western age, because one could envision a situation where the remaining Western countries band together and sort of to try and preserve what they see as a rules-based international order. It could be that China emerges and, we're moving into the Pacific age. It could be that we're into a very chaotic world with no obvious center. It could be that, although I wouldn't bank on it, but don't rule out completely the possibility that some of these nascent formations like the G20 and the BRICS would provide some kind of gathering point which would be a kind of a new global order which retains some of the Western legacy, but also nuances it with, elements of the political systems in those countries or the political tradition. So it's hard to say, but I think it is historic in the sense that I think we can definitely say we'll never go back. There is no going back. And the reason I say there's no going back is in the first Trump presidency, the world was able to persuade itself that Trump was an aberration, that he only won office because America was in an insurgent mood and the Democrats, cast around to find the most establishment candidate they could, who was not very popular to begin with. And they just lost. And they lost because so many Democratic voters stayed home because nobody believed Donald Trump would win the election, and they would never make that mistake again. And 2020 came and we're restored back to normality. But then what we didn't, then 2024 comes. And this time around, Trump is not. He's not hiding what he's going to do. None of this. Nobody can really say that. Oh, this is such a shock. He said he was going to do this, and he got the vote to do it. And look, I mean, most of his base are still behind him on this. So even if Trump fails and goes down, the Trump administration goes down in flames. America has shown that there's no longer a majority to support that role as the leader of a Western order. It's becoming more nativist, more insular. And I think that's therefore the rest of the world will act accordingly. And I think any country that tries to persuade itself that, we can somehow get back to the way things were with America just by being nice to Trump is fooling itself. I mean, because the guy, you can reach a deal with Trump, and as he's shown, even the deals he negotiates himself, he'll tear them up as soon as they stop being convenient to him. So,
right.
So I
but
think,
but in all fairness, he not to come to Trump's defense, but I don't think he said on the campaign trail he would, 51st state, take over Greenland. Maybe I don't even think he was
that's true. Those are bizarre. Yeah, those are just
I don't even
weird.
think he was that pro-war. Like he was saying that Biden's too hawkish on war and foreign policy.
Well, yeah, I don't know if he's necessarily pro-war, except on Israel, but Biden was even more so. I think his view, apparently what they're talking about in the White House, bizarrely, with Greenland, is they're saying, look, everybody in Greenland gets the equivalent of 60,000 euros from the Danish government. That's the subsidy they get. So we'll just beat that. We'll make them a better offer. Now, what's peculiar about that is the art of the deal. What's very peculiar about that is just the thinking behind it, that, people's 401ks are going up in smoke and they're going to have to extend their retirements by a couple of years. And this guy's saying, let's buy Greenland. In other words, if you can find the money to buy Greenland, maybe you could do something to top up my 401k. So it's very peculiar. The Canadian case, this kind of notion that, again, it would be economic extortion. We just bring them to their knees. And it's just a crazy idea. So I don't know where those are coming from. You're right. He didn't say those on the campaign trail, but he did talk about tariffs. He did talk about going after his enemies. He did talk about going after judges. He did talk about going after the media. I mean, he's doing all of that. So people saying, well, certainly nobody can complain about the tariffs. Nobody who voted for him can complain about the tariffs. He said he was going to do it and he's doing it. And Elon Musk did say during the campaign that we'd crash the economy in order to rebuild it. It didn't exactly get strong pushback from Trump. So that they were never that. And the whole Project 2025 thing. I mean, of course, some of those ideas are working their way into the administration. So, he said he'd shut down the Department of Education. He said, now he did say he wasn't going to touch Social Security and Medicare, and then has turned Elon Musk loose on it. And that will be interesting to see what comes of that. That could be the end of Elon Musk. I don't know. I mean, we were hearing rumors that Elon Musk is on his way out the door, but we haven't heard anything definitive yet.
Can we talk about those new agreements that are being drafted up, like Project 2025, the new, I don't even know what it's called. It's like they're trying to replace NAFTA. I mean, there's so much misinformation online, but we need it from the source. We need a professional like Dr. Rapley.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, Cass, I don't think there is an expert on this because it's, as I say, you can look at two countries and you can say, okay, in a trade negotiation, what would be the logical thing to do? But I'm not seeing any logic. I'm not quite sure. I mean, look what they're doing to the auto industry with these tariffs. It's crazy. Anybody could tell them it's crazy. But I don't think so. I have no idea, what the guy's trying to do when it comes to, and I think I'm not sure he himself knows. And I don't know if anybody in his administration knows. Yeah. So the support base for the Republicans, and how much support there'd be for something like Project 2025, which essentially is to recreate America as a kind of white, really as a Christian nation, I think is what it's trying to do. A Christian free market, small state, with power focused on the states rather than the federal government. And again, I think they would probably see Trump as being the vehicle by which, whether or not they see, I mean, the kind of the Christian evangelical view, which would be of Trump, those Christian evangelicals who support Trump would say, is yes, he's a flawed individual, but then God uses people, even, he used David, he used Solomon, and therefore he's using Trump, and we must vote for him because this is the vehicle through which God does his work. But the people who actually hold to that belief are probably about 25% of the electorate, from what I can tell. So about half the Republican constituency, and the other half would be much more traditional Republicans, low taxes, deregulation, free markets, but more or less internationalists, anti-communist, suspicious of both the Chinese and the Russians, defense of democracy, but not necessarily exporting democracy. And then you would have, as I say, the swing voters. So the swing voters are already turning on Trump, and they never would have really had any interest at all in Project 2025, unless Project 2025 had a plan to bring down their egg prices. The traditional Republicans are now starting to waver. There's pretty clear signs in the polling. But the actual base, the MAGA base, I think will stand by him through thick and thin. There's no sign they're losing any kind of faith. His problem, well, it's not necessarily his problem. The Republican Party's problem is that in most constituencies in the US, that's not a big enough vote to win you your seat. But it is a sufficiently organized and energized movement that they can prevent you getting the nomination, through the primary process. So that creates a kind of, for a lot of congressional Republicans, they're between a rock and a hard place. They might not necessarily be all that happy with the direction in which things are going, but they dare not speak out against it. And as I say, I think the damage has to be really severe before they're going to feel sufficiently emboldened to do that. And that's a real danger, I think, for the Republican Party. So in that creates a sort of window for people around Trump who want to pursue their various agendas, some of which would fit under the rubric of Project 2025, like, going after the Department of Education, going after abortion rights in the States, going after sex education in schools, going after books they don't like in their local libraries, to use that cover to do that. Whether or not Trump himself is deeply invested, they have a window of opportunity, but it's a rather narrow window. It's probably going to close by about the autumn at the rate things are going. So they have to move quickly, which is what they're doing. And there is a kind of this move fast and break things approach that Trump is using. There is a political risk that it's effective in that it keeps his opponents on the back foot and completely disorganized. But on the other hand, if just as we see with this tariff announcement, it can also lead to some slapdash policymaking, which is ultimately going to be harmful to the country's interests. And as I say, I think if he were running for another term, he might be more sensitive to public opinion. But I think he probably feels liberated now, and he sees he's got a short period of time in which to accomplish what he wants to do personally, for his own well-being, for his family, and to settle a bunch of scores. This is his last chance to do it. So I think he's acting with urgency, and he's got a lot of scores to settle.
Right.
He's made a lot of enemies in the course of his lifetime.
When it comes to, I guess, his loyal support base, it's a human nature problem, right? The sunk cost fallacy. Like, I've been supporting this guy for so long, everyone's saying that I'm an idiot for supporting him. So it's like when you're a kid and your parent says, "Oh, you can't do that, you can't do that." It's like, well, I want to do it even more now. I'm going to defend him even harder. Is it like that? I don't really know, because people are becoming like really left and right it seems like people are becoming even more radicalized now. And like the ramp up is so fast. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. I think there's some interesting research that shows that what is really happening is that the media universe has become so fragmented that whereas, let's say 40, 50 years ago, everybody kind of got their news from the same sources. There was a narrow spectrum of options available. Um, you could watch Fox News or you could watch CNN, but that was about it. Fox News would be right wing, but it didn't necessarily have white supremacists or conspiracy theorists. But those people have now been able to connect with an audience via social media. And therefore now we've got this ecosystem in which, and this doesn't just apply in politics, it's really interesting. Someone wrote a really interesting article some time ago saying, no, we live in an age where nobody is famous anymore. And what they meant is that, depending on the musical genre you like, you'll know who the big celebrities in that particular genre are, but there can be an adjacent genre that you don't listen to, and you haven't got a clue who the star is in that particular. And the same goes
Right.
with film. The same goes. So people will talk about, Brat Summer, and and that everybody who knows about what Brat is last summer, gets the reference, but 80% of the population haven't got a clue and don't care, And so we see in politics where you just don't listen, you don't hear these views, which would be contrary to your own. And the integrative institutions that, if you take, for example, I think one of the interesting dynamics within the Republican Party, but this has also happened in the Democratic Party, but some of the most militant supporters for Trump are actually not churchgoers. The liberals will blame, this is this radicalization of this evangelical Christianity, but in fact, they're not the most militant supporters. It's actually non-churchgoers, because one of the interesting things is today in a country like America or a country like Canada, it's only a small part of the population which goes to church, and so therefore they're very committed and by and large invested. Whereas 50 years ago, where you would have had a very substantial part of the population going to church, and a lot of them wouldn't have been really that invested, but it was just what you did on a Sunday, and kind of, you felt your children should be exposed to church and that sort of thing. And so the result is you had those integrative institutions whereby people who wouldn't normally associate with one another, because there wasn't a self-selection process. You weren't just choosing your peer group according to those that you like. You were kind of thrust into these social gatherings and forced to sort of, find ways. And so it was said that this was, this is Putnam's theory, right, about bowling alone, that it was said that this forced us to learn to live with one another and to tolerate difference. But now we don't have to do that. We choose our peer groups, we choose our friend groups, we swipe only onto those that we want to associate with. We unfriend those whose views we don't like. And we have done what Trump has done with his administration, which is we've surrounded ourselves with people who affirm our view of the world and feed us back the same thing. And we don't make an effort to actually challenge our way of thinking, to ask ourselves, what could we be doing differently? And I think this goes across the spectrum. I think, if you look at one of the things that the MAGA crowd, they really are cheering on Trump's, evisceration of university research. Well, in fairness, they have a reason to resent, because, for decades, I worked in the university sector, and I could see the way that the same thing was happening in universities, where increasingly, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, people were becoming more elitist, they weren't mixing with people outside their social circle. They tended to echo views that they considered acceptable, and they felt it was acceptable to sort of just completely neutralizes the voices of those whose views they didn't share. And even though my own sympathies lay on the left, I was really alarmed with the direction things were going. I felt a kind of betrayal of the need to sort of be involved in society. And so I think you've had this fragmentation. It's turned into outright war. Well, we'll destroy the universities. The other one's saying, well, we should destroy, these know nothings, and and it's become really uncivil. And I don't know what the solution is, although it's going to end up being some form of social media regulation, which I think is coming, and less freedom for the social media sites to do things the way they want, which they've enjoyed to a very considerable degree so far.
It's pretty, I mean, you have a Twitter account. I see that you post sometimes. The amount of like deranged stuff that you see on social media now is just crazy. And you've talked about this. I mean, your book before last, Twilight of the Money Gods, Economics as a Religion and How It All Went Wrong. This is kind of what you articulated, is like there are new religions, replacing traditional religions, capital R religions. And it seems like politics is a new religion.
I think it is interesting the way a good chunk of Donald Trump's following almost think of him as a cult leader. That kind of belief that the guy's a genius. You just have to trust he knows what he's doing, even if I can't tell. And who am I to question? And I think that probably reflects a level of frustration and desperation, with the existing political system, that you're not being listened to, which is a legitimate, as I was saying, I think that's legitimate for ordinary people to feel that way, because that is the way. Certainly, if I look at American politics, which I think is a particularly troubled state, Democratic elites have been very patronizing and condescending, and still are.
Right.
I think towards ordinary people. I mean, their own view of working people is very much based on cliches. I found it hilarious after Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election. The Democrats organized these so-called, listening tours where they'd all get on a bus and drive around the country, supposedly to hear the views of ordinary Americans. What did we miss? But as far as I could tell, the only people they were listening to was one another on these bus rides. Right. I mean, there was no sense at all that they're getting out and meeting other Americans.
But like some of the stats are just crazy. Like I recently moved back to Canada from the US, and I lived in El Paso, Texas for a little over a year. And you could just see, like, it was rough, man. Like, you would be at Walmart and you would see, a family use like 3 credit cards to pay for their groceries. And then you look it up and it's like, oh, okay, well, apparently half of the country lives paycheck to paycheck. It's like, how is this going to end well? You know what I mean? When you talk about America kind of declining and it being the end of an empire, it feels like that just happened too quickly. I mean, the US came into power as like the world leader in World War II. At the end of World War II, it's been less than 100 years. And I think in your book, you mentioned that the average tenure of an empire is like 300. It's like, how is it accelerating so fast?
Well, partly is the world does move more quickly, technological progress. And we talked about this, my co-author and I, we'd often get this question, and, he points out that the big difference between modern empires and those of antiquity was that the rate of technological progress in the time of the Roman Empire was so slow that it took centuries to bring about the change that can take place in a matter of years. So things get very compressed. And the other thing too is I think America was always a reluctant empire, in the sense that there was always a faction in America, which is now coming back to the fore, which was isolationist and didn't want to basically be involved in the world. I think the problem they are going to have, and they are having, is they still want all the benefits that come from being an empire, but none of the obligations. And I think that's the difficulty. This kind of thinking that we can extort anything from anybody, not realizing that the whole system depends on their willing participation in the regime. I mean, that the reason America has grown so prosperous is that in no small measure, the whole world banks in US dollars, but that depends on a degree of trust in the American hegemony being a benign one. And then when that's lost, all that money gets pulled out. I mean, if you look at that idea from Mar-a-Lago Accord, if you read that paper, the Stephen Moran's paper.
Can you explain that? I did not.
I mean, it was
just listeners have either.
It was basically a protection racket. It was essentially, okay, well, you're a country you have money in reserves that you've banked in America, which we get to lend and we get to spend. And we're going to now basically say to you, you have to switch that into a 100-year bond that pays no interest. And then we get to have that money. If you don't, first, if you enjoy any kind of protection from us in NATO, we stop protecting you, and we'll put all these tariffs on. I mean, it was basically give us your money or else. Now, the message that sends, it's not going to amount to anything. They're not going to do it anyway. It's all been superseded by these tariffs that Trump has gone ahead and imposed without any kind of Mar-a-Lago Accord. But message it sent to the world was, there was always this understanding that you could, it's like a bank. The United States was the world's bank, that you could put your money in the US and you could take it out at any time. It was your money. But suddenly you have a government saying, actually, no, we might just lock the bank's doors and keep that money for ourselves. And even if it's just floated as a thought experiment, the very idea that it would, enter into the halls of the White House has sent such a chill through the world that already that, if that happens, as I say, if foreign investors start liquidating their shares in the U.S. stock market, the U.S. stock market is going to face a much rougher ride than any other stock market in the world. It's going to be a difficult time. So it, what was it in Spider-Man? With great power goes great responsibility. I mean, America had great power and it got a lot of privileges from it, but it had to bear a certain burden of responsibility. If it doesn't want to do that, it doesn't get to have the power.
I remember a couple of years ago, we were talking about COVID and just the resilience of developing countries, and how in the first world, the slightest inconvenience just causes craziness, radical outbreaks. And I guess my question is, you're a very well-traveled guy. How are your friends in other countries kind of faring with this? How are they interpreting it? Like places like Brazil or Jamaica or other places that you've been?
So it's interesting that a day or two before Trump announced his tariffs, there was a paper put out by the Aston Business School in Britain, and they sort of came up with an economic model that estimated what the impact of tariffs would be on various countries around the world. What is interesting is, in terms of the relative hit, the ones that come off worse are actually, funnily enough, America's close friends. It's Europe, Canada, Mexico, Japan. Developing countries, I mean, they take a hit, but it's relatively not as bad. And arguably, a lot of them have the resources to manage. For example, if you take China, which isn't, it's kind of halfway between being developing and developed, but China, I would say, if the United States and China get into an full-blown trade war, the thinking in the White House is we'll win because we import a lot more from them than they do from us, so we can do a lot more harm to their economy. I think that's a completely mistaken view. It's basically arithmetic. It's what they've done in coming up with these tariffs is you just do a quick little division or subtraction and you come up with the difference, and then you say if it's positive in your favor, you win the war. But this isn't marbles. That's not the way it works. This is calculus. And the calculus is the following. Trump has no electoral mandate, nor do congressional Republicans, for driving the U.S. economy into a recession in order to win a trade war. The Chinese communist leadership, first off, doesn't need a mandate. because it's not elected, but more importantly, any country that sees itself being bullied, and Canada attests to this, that if it regards it as an existential threat, you can get a very strong mandate for a lot of pain and hardship from your public in order to impose damage on the other side. And the thing about a trade war, as you know, I love to use boxing analogies, but I've always said that in boxing, what made Mike Tyson such a successful champion wasn't that he could impose more damage on his opponents than they could on him, because a lot of the boxers he fought could have done more damage to him than he could do to them. They were bigger punchers, they were stronger, they were bigger. The thing about Mike Tyson is he seemed not to have a pain threshold. There seemed to be no limit of punishment he would take, and every one of his opponents sensed that up until the latter stages of her career. And in that calculus, they lost. And the same thing I would go in a trade war. China can absorb a lot of punishment. The other thing it does have, its fiscal situation is better, and it can draw upon a huge pool of domestic savings in order to provide the fiscal stimulus needed to support domestic consumption during a recession. The problem America will have in a trade war, if it was picking a fight with China alone, it might be different, but it's picked a fight with the entire planet. And if accompanying its trade war, which is going to impose damages on the economy, is an unwillingness of the rest of the world to keep underwriting U.S. debt by buying U.S. Treasury bonds, it doesn't have the domestic pool of savings, anything like China's, and it has already a high debt to GDP ratio. So I think in this battle, China is going to outlast it. And I think that goes in much of the developing world. Public indebtedness is much lower than in Western countries. So it's going to be hardship, but these are also countries where the citizenry is often used to hardship, and so they will be able to deal with it. So I don't see the United States. I see it getting, and I think at the end of the day with Trump, victory is performative. If a foreign leader, and this has been tried and tested successfully several times, a foreign leader goes to Washington and begs Trump for forgiveness and says, we'll buy $100 billion worth of soybeans or whatever. And he announces, I scored a win. You see, this is what makes America great. They don't end up buying the soybeans. They just make an announcement and he gets his win. And I think that's the way a lot of it. I think in the short term, there's going to be some performative groveling at the White House, which will be good enough to keep Trump happy and possibly his followers. But I think in the meantime, countries will be diversifying. And they will be diversifying in large measure east and south. India, they're going to be new markets they're trying to cultivate ties with, because that's where the bulk of future global demand is going to be anyway. So I think this is accelerating the U.S. decline relative to, the rising world. And I think it's going to set it back in that race, possibly permanently.
You mentioned the word performative, and that's kind of what I wonder with the U.S. situation. I mean, obviously, the implications of talking about this stuff are dire, but to your point, how much of this stuff is going to be followed through on? Like, is Canada going to be the 51st state? Probably not. That'd be my guess. But
no,
I mean, yeah.
Honestly, Cas, I suspect that in another 6 months, these issues will have fallen off the agenda in America, because they're going to have far bigger things to deal with, far bigger problems to deal with. They're going to be dealing with a slide towards recession, rising inflation, a possible stock market crash. So even if Trump might be prattling on about it still, I don't think it's going to get very far on the policy agenda. So I don't think those are going to amount to much. Now, of course, not a lot, but some hinges on the outcome of the Canadian election, which is in 3 weeks' time.
What's your opinion on that?
Sure.
I'd love to get your take there.
Well, at the moment, it looks like the Liberals will win another majority, against all expectations a couple of months ago, where they looked to be en route to annihilation. Trump has breathed new life into, Liberal hopes and Liberal prospects. And of course, they chose a new leader.